Morning, everyone. I'll have some remarks in English and then in French, and then happy to take your questions. I'm here today to speak to Canadians and Albertans alike. Over the past few months, the Premier of Alberta has been systematically attacking the most vulnerable in our community and creating confusion and chaos for Albertans. It started with her reckless and irresponsible plan to take Alberta out of the Canada Pension Plan, putting the pensions of not only Albertans, but millions of Canadians at risk. The CPP is foundational. People rely on it, and they work hard every day to have a safe and secure retirement. And at a time when Canadians are struggling with high costs of living, the dismantling of a system that people rely on is simply irresponsible. And yet, we're not just talking about the CPP. A week ago, parents in Alberta had to scramble to make last-minute arrangements for their childcare arrangements as daycares across the province closed for the day in rolling closures. Why? That's a question you have to ask Premier Smith. Because $10 a day childcare is transformational, it's working across the country, and it's saving Albertans about $10,000 a year. And our government the federal government came to the table with $3.8 billion to make childcare affordable for Albertans. And not only did the government of Alberta not spend all of that money, they posted a budgetary surplus last year of $5.5 billion. So the UCP government signed on to this deal, and they need to make it work in Alberta. It works in British Columbia, it works in Nova Scotia, it can work in my home province as well. And let me be clear, there's no reason why childcare workers shouldn't be paid good wages and salaries as they do some of the most important work in society, that of caring for our children. So this mismanagement by the Premier on this issue, leaving children and childcare workers out in the cold, is hurting Alberta families. And we're seeing the same mismanagement when it comes to our healthcare system. After our government came to the table with billions of dollars in healthcare funding, Alberta is still facing long ER wait times and inadequate care. Now, as if that wasn't enough, last week the Premier announced the most draconian and harmful policies for young people in the country. And I know, because this was my case, the vast majority of Canadian parents and Alberta parents are loving and accepting of their children no matter where they are. And parents play the most important role in the life of a child, and that is how it should be. But the sad reality is that that's not the case for everyone. And by mandating that schools force kids out of the closet before many of them are ready, she's taking away the safe space for some young people. What she has proposed, to ban young LGBTQ2 kids from being who they are, puts lives at risk. And the decision to come out to one's family does not belong to a teacher, a school. It definitely does not belong to a Premier. That is a person's decision alone. I was a young closeted kid in the 1980s growing up in the Ralph Klein era, and my parents were the last people I told. And why is that? Because it's the hardest relationship. It's the hardest people to tell, because you're never sure what's going to happen. And yet, I felt safe enough to tell my parents, because when kids come out to their parents, when they feel safe to tell their parents, they do. So why is the Premier doing all this? Why is she threatening the financial futures of Albertans and Canadians? Why is she purposely underfunding childcare? Why is she not focused on building a strong healthcare system? Why is she targeting the most vulnerable in our community? These are the real questions that the Premier has to answer for. And unfortunately, it's not just the Premier. Pierre Poilievre's entire caucus, including all of the Alberta Conservative MPs, have been muzzled. They've been instructed to be silent on this, just as they are silent on the CPP. Well, let me be clear. Silence is complicity. So while the Premier is here today in Ottawa, I ask her to reconsider these harmful and dangerous policies. Our government has been at the table. We want to work with the Alberta government to deliver for Albertans. That is my job as Minister and as MP for Edmonton Centre on everything: healthcare, childcare, fighting climate change, supporting the middle class, and taking care of vulnerable kids. And I will continue to do that work every day. Plus rapidement en français, au cours des derniers mois, la Première ministre de l'Alberta s'est attaquée systématiquement aux personnes les plus vulnérables de notre communauté et sème la confusion et le chaos chez moi en Alberta. Elle a commencé avec le régime du Canada, qui est un élément fondamental des retraites des millions de Canadiens ainsi que les Albertains. Il n'y a pas que le régime du pension du Canada. On parle aussi du fait que pas seulement Mme Smith veut retirer les Albertains du régime de pension du Canada, elle a systématiquement sous-financé le système de garderie dans la province. Et c'est impensable, parce qu'elle a laissé de l'argent ici à Ottawa et elle a un surplus de 4,4 milliards de dollars. Donc, je ne sais pas qu'est-ce qu'elle est en train de faire. Et on ne peut jamais dire qu'elle n'a pas assez d'argent pour payer les personnes dans les garderies assez d'argent, parce qu'elle a ce surplus de 5,5 milliards de dollars. Aussi, on a une mauvaise gestion du système de santé. Et malgré le fait qu'on a ajouté presque 6 milliards de dollars dans le système, on a toujours des lignes d'attente trop longues et une mauvaise, pas seulement réputation, mais le système n'est pas efficace en ce moment et c'est la responsabilité de la première ministre de gérer cette affaire. Et comme si ça ne suffisait pas, elle a décidé la semaine dernière d'attaquer aux gens les plus vulnérables dans notre communauté, les jeunes. Et pour qu'on ait très clair là-dessus, la grande majorité des parents canadiens et albertains aiment et acceptent leurs enfants, peu importe qui soient et qui sont. Et les parents jouent un rôle primordial dans le développement des jeunes. Et la triste réalité, c'est que ce n'est pas le cas pour tout le monde. En obligeant les écoles à sortir les enfants du placard avant qu'un nombre d'eux ne soit pas prêts, elle prive certains jeunes d'un espace seul. Et ce qu'elle propose, interdire aux jeunes LGBTQ2 d'être ce qu'ils sont, va mettre des vies en danger. La décision de faire son coming out à sa famille et à ses proches ne s'applique pas à un enseignant, n'appartient pas à une école et certainement pas à la première ministre de l'Alberta. C'est une décision de la personne seule. Donc, les questions sont les suivantes. Pourquoi la première ministre fait tout cela? Pourquoi elle menace l'avenir financier des Albertains? Pourquoi elle sous-finance délibérément le système de garderie et de santé? Et pourquoi elle veut s'attaquer aux personnes les plus vulnérables? Et malheureusement, ce n'est pas seulement la première ministre, c'est aussi le Parti conservateur du Canada et Pierre Poilievre qui a insisté que ces députés albertains et canadiens soient silencieux sur cette question. Et donc, la première ministre albertaine est ici à Ottawa aujourd'hui et elle a des questions auxquelles j'espère qu'elle va répondre. Rafi?
Right now, you are just sort of amping up the rhetoric against what the Premier is proposing, and it's not really legislated yet, right? She's proposing to do this. Aren't you just emboldening her instead of coming up more strongly and saying the government will fight you in court over this? Why won't you take that step?
Well, we have to take a look at the legislation, Rafi, and I've been now at 2 rallies in my home province. I've been spending a lot of time on the phone with people back home. We need to see exactly what she's proposing. This is a thought balloon right now, a warm, fuzzy video that holds a bunch of daggers for our community. People want to know what exactly is in that legislation. Egal Canada has already said that they're going to come out and advance a court case. I don't even want it to get to that point. I've been very clear in the rallies, and I'm clear here today with all of you that we have to kill this bill before it gets to the House of the Legislature. And people need to call their UCP MLAs, particularly those in Calgary and around the city of Edmonton, to tell them this is not on. This is not the Alberta of today. So I hope we don't get to a court challenge, but we're going to look at every single option. And it's really important that Albertans and Canadians lean in and say, this is not the Canada of today.
What about the notwithstanding clause? The Premier hasn't shut the door on that one.
That's why I need to see the legislation, right? Is this going to be a preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause? We have no idea. We haven't seen legislation yet. And she's set this in motion now and scared people, terrified people, because I talked to them at the rallies and on the phone. This is not going to happen until September. So what's the point of that? And I think the bigger question to ask is what and who is she solving for? What's the problem she's trying to fix, right? Queer kids don't need to be fixed. They're fine the way they are. And so this bill should never see the floor of the ledge.
You're here talking to us today. Do you have a plan to speak to the Premier? Do your colleagues have a plan to speak to the Premier directly and raise these concerns with her?
I've invited the Premier to a meeting the day after she put this video out. Actually, within hours of putting the video out, we asked her for a meeting. We have yet to hear back from the Premier.
Jusqu'où vous êtes prêt à aller? Et puis, dans un deuxième temps, allez-vous participer aussi à la manifestation ce soir à Ottawa?
En ordre inverse, oui, je vais être à la rallye aujourd'hui, une manifestation, absolument. Et en ce qui concerne les options, il faut regarder la législation, comme votre collègue vient de nous poser. Qu'est-ce qui arrive si le clause non-obstant est là-dedans? Ça va ajouter toute une autre dimension à l'affaire. Mais comme je viens de dire à vos collègues, moi, je veux que cette législation ne passe même pas à la Chambre, à la législature en Alberta. Moi, je vais tuer ce projet de loi même avant que ça passe à la législature. Et ça, c'est pourquoi les gens maintenant peuvent appeler leur député UCP à Calgary et à l'extérieur d'Edmonton pour indiquer que l'Alberta de 2024, c'est pas ça, et on va protéger nos jeunes.
Et votre relation avec Mme Smith, comme aujourd'hui, vous ne la verrez pas, vous ne la rencontrerez pas. Là. Il n'y a pas eu de contact entre votre bureau et son bureau depuis mercredi dernier.
Je pense pas que je suis le ministre favori à Mme Smith ces jours-ci, mais ma tâche, c'est de livrer la marchandise pour les Albertains et j'aimerais qu'elle fasse la même chose dans son poste comme première ministre.
With this office opening up, do you see that as a potential symptom of all the talk of Western alienation, especially considering most Albertans do still vote Conservative?
Actually, I think that any province that has offices in Ottawa that wants to advocate for their citizens is a good move. And since I've been an MP in 2015, and certainly since I've been minister, I've been saying to Alberta businesses, associations, and leaders to spend more time in Ottawa. So as long as we're working on the things that matter, housing, childcare, healthcare, building up the province for the future, focusing on things like the Dow announcement and Heidelberg Minerals, and the fact that we have a hydrogen economy that we can build, I'll work with any official of the government of Alberta every day. But when they come after my community and trans kids, that's not on. And so we have to stand up for people, not because it's the political thing to do, because it's the right thing to do.
You mentioned it in your remarks, but what do you make of the silence we've seen from the federal Conservatives on this? What do you think prompted that response?
Silence is complicity. Pierre Poilievre and his Conservative MPs don't want to talk about these issues. They think that this is a way to play to their right-wing base. They do not want to take on issues that matter fundamentally, not just to the kids we're talking about, but all of their parents. And this is right-wing American-style politics, culture wars that they're trying to import from the United States. I bet that the Premier talked about this with Tucker Carlson when she was in my city only a couple of weeks ago. And we have to stand up across the country, because if we think that this is just Alberta and Saskatchewan and New Brunswick, what are other Conservative premiers getting ready to do? And if we let Danielle Smith go this far, what are other jurisdictions going to do? We have to stand up and call this out now. So Conservatives are being cowardly in not sticking up for Canadian children.
Do you think that was a direct result of Tucker Carlson's visit? Like, do you think he had any influence on what was announced?
I don't know if he had any direct influence, but I can tell you what we're seeing from his MAGA-style politics. This is Ron DeSantis, Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, coming up north.
Pourquoi vous craignez que ça ait une influence sur les autres provinces? Vous avez dit 2 ou 3 fois, là, les conservateurs, le silence des conservateurs est complice.
Oui.
En quoi vous craignez que ça ait un effet boule de neige?
Moi, je pense que les premiers ministres à travers le pays conservateur gèrent tellement mal leur dossier qu'ils ont besoin de distractions. Et la meilleure façon pour eux d'avoir des distractions, c'est d'aller jouer sur la politique sociale. Donc, en important les cultures de guerre, comme on voit aux États-Unis, avec Ron DeSantis et sa dit pas gay législation, c'est facile pour les premiers ministres conservateurs de distraire leur population pour créer des mini-crises qui n'existent pas en réalité. Quand on regarde les faits, quand on parle de population trans, on parle de 1,2, peut-être 1,5% de la population. Donc, pourquoi Mme Smith, Premier ministre Moe, Premier ministre Higgs sont en train d'aller chercher, aller attaquer la jeunesse? C'est parce qu'ils veulent distraire de leur propre ingérence.
But we've already seen in Saskatchewan's case that they are willing to use a notwithstanding clause. And as you say, if this is a larger trend, rhetoric aside, your government hasn't really done anything different than what a possible future Conservative government could do. I mean, Mr. Poilievre has kept this in the realm of rhetoric. So what's stopping your government from bringing a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada asking about the use of the notwithstanding clause, which these premiers would be able to use to get these kind of policies through?
It's a great question, and I think that is one of the areas that we have to continue to reflect on as a federal government. I think that is an important legal tool, and that's why we will be paying very close attention to see what's in Premier Smith's legislation, which I hope never makes it to the floor of the ledge.
But why do you need to wait for that? We've already seen Saskatchewan do this. We've seen there's already court challenges of similar policies. Why do you have to wait until the fall?
Well, I think it's a good idea, and I think it's a conversation that our government should continue to pursue. My focus today is making sure that the trans kids and LGBT kids in Alberta who are feeling threatened know that their federal government is here. And the campaign, if you're wondering what we're doing, is we're mobilizing and making sure that people reach out to folks in Alberta who have the power here, which is the UCP MLAs in the legislature who can vote against this and make sure that this doesn't happen.
There seems to be a gap in between the rhetoric and the action here, though. Even like going back to the Saskatchewan case, Minister Ian called it a matter of life and death for trans kids. So if it's a matter of life and death, why haven't we seen more action at this point? That sounds very urgent versus we're going to wait and see what happens in the fall.
Well, I think the fact that you've seen now the medical bodies, the Alberta Medical Association, the Canadian Medical Association, you've now seen other bodies rise up and say what the Premier is doing is actually going to cause children harm. And look, the Premier is in her jurisdiction to do this. And what I'm saying is Albertans who want to see this change need to rise up and mobilize, and that's what we're doing. And we are going to continue to look at every option that we have here on the table.
few days to marinate on this. Can you
Yeah.
update us on what measures, actions, levers that the government is actually looking at to respond to potential policy when it comes out, when the legislation comes out?
So the legislation will matter, but right now, in the short term, it's mobilizing. It's letting the Premier know that she thought she was trying to somehow take the politics out of this issue, depoliticize it. She's done exactly the opposite. She has made this a hot burning issue because this matters to people in the province. I mean, I talk to parents of trans kids. I talk to people who are in the medical system in Alberta, and they do not want to see this take place. We talked to teachers at the Alberta Teacher Association who said, I don't care if there's a mandate from the Premier to call kids out. I will never out a kid in my classroom. And so what we can do right now is get Albertans to write to their UCP MLAs. We can get Canadians to let the Premier know that they're not happy about this. And when we see the legislation, we can be very clear about the steps that we can take. I'm very interested in what Egal Canada will be doing on the legal side, and I'll continue to follow this file very closely. Rafi?
You mentioned your concern about other Conservative premiers. Have you seen anything in Atlantic Canada or Ontario that makes that fear concrete?
Not yet, but stay tuned. I mean, I think you should ask those governments what they're planning to do. In the absence of coming out and defending kids in this space, it begs the question, what's being planned?
Is there an issue with the Saskatchewan case, though, preventing the government from bringing forward a reference case on the use of the notwithstanding clause here? It's like that legislation, it's done, it's passed, it's law. Like,
Yeah, a reference case would, I mean, ask the Minister of Justice about this. I'm not a lawyer. But if you ask Minister Virani about this, any sort of such case would then, I think, apply to the future, to future uses of the notwithstanding clause. But I do think it's important for us to focus on what we're talking about here right now, which is protecting the kids and asking, why are the premiers doing this? Why are they trying to fix kids for whom nothing is broken? LGBT kids are fine just the way they are. There is no problem to solve here. And so why is she doing this? Thanks, everyone. Bonne journée.